Yo, what's up everybody, it's Victon here with another video on the age-old discussion of Elementalist Golems or Necromancer Golems. I'm going to be going over all the differences, good and bad, between each option. I'm going to walk you guys through the different topics such as league starting, build costs, gear progression, DPS comparison, survivability comparison, boss killing, mapping, and finally, for those min-maxers out there, which ascendancy offers the best option for min-maxing the build. Throughout the discussion, I'll of course throw up some gameplay footage for you guys so y'all can check out the builds in action. Before we get started though, remember to hit that like button if you end up enjoying this video, and subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. Also, check out in the description below, I'm going to have the most up-to-date guides for both an Elementalist and Necromancer Carrion Golem build, and some relevant crafting guides for their gear, and up-to-date Animate Guardian guide that I use for both of these builds. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our first topic, league starting. Alright, so it's your first character of the league, and you of course want to be crushing all the content in the game to really get you going and set up for a successful league. But the question is, which version of the build should you play? Well, there's a few very important things to consider for a league starter. Most importantly being, your character will likely need to be able to tackle most all of the content up to and including red tier maps for very little currency, if any at all. You typically want to be spending your early currency progressing through the game instead of dumping it into a character for small gains. Early on in the league, there won't be that great of items to buy, and crafting will just cost way too much to really justify it early on. With that being said, let's take a look at the build costs for each league starter version of the Carrion Golem builds. Simply put, your Elementalist Carrion Golem build can be done completely solo self-found, all the way to red maps if you so choose. Ideally though, you'd want to spend about 1 exalt on a few key items, those being 2 clay shaper weapons for +2 to maximum golems, and then a 6-link chest for about 30 to 40 chaos. Those 3 items right there, along with just collecting and crafting self-found gear, will get you all the way to tier 16 maps and even on to some in-game bosses. You can clear all the Guardians, Shaper, Elder, and all those entry-level in-game bosses with ease. Mapping will be a bit slow but very safe, and you'll be able to easily farm some currency very quickly since you won't be spending much if any on your gear upgrades. As far as the Necromancer version, you'll likely have to start as the life version instead of a low life or snacking version because you won't have the gear yet. That means you'll have roughly the same setup as the Elementalist version, but you'll have a bit less survivability since you're only going to have 4 Carrion Golems versus the Elementalist, which will be rocking 4 Carrion Golems and a Stone Golem and a Chaos Golem. The damage will be about the same, but like I said, just a bit less tanky. Eventually, once you hit yellow tier maps and have a bit of currency saved up, you're going to be wanting to start switching over to the budget low life version. This switch is going to cost you a few exalts and will get you about the same survivability level of the Elementalist, and again the DPS will be about the same at that point. I'd say you'll be likely to complete your budget version of the low life aura stacking Necro around when you enter or are halfway through red tier maps. At that point you'll spend about 5 to 10 exalts on your gear, be about the same level of tankiness as the elemental version has, but you're going to be out DPSing the elemental version at this point in progression, so that's a nice little bonus. Same thing at this point, you're going to be easily able to clear all of those in-game bosses and start crushing the scary in-game bosses like Uber Elder and the Maven Invitation fights. At that point, I would say that we've exited the league start phase and you're going to be on your way to in-game version of the build. With that being said, let's go back to our initial question of which ascendancy is better, Elementalist or Necromancer for a league start character. Personally, I'm going with an Elementalist. I think the fact that you can clear all the way through red tier maps, and even those in-game bosses, the early ones at least, on a budget of only 1 to 2 exalts is just far too good to pass up. With Elementalist, you can take the purchasing of your primordial gems a little bit slower as well, since you get a natural +2 golems from your ascendancy points, and with 2 clay shapers you get another +2. You'll have your 6 golems right from the start of mapping, whereas the Necro version will be stuck with 4 and can only use 3 to 4 actually Carrion Golems, depending on if you're using a shield or 2 clay shapers. Basically, you come online a lot faster and for a lot less currency than the Necro version that's slowly transitioning into a low life version for aura stacking. That means you're going to be able to progress faster and more efficiently, which eventually nets you more currency in the long run. The faster you get to in-game content, the better, since that's where all the real currency making strategies start happening. So that actually transitioned us nicely into our next section. Once you've gotten to the point where you're going to be making some nice currency and are able to start upgrading your build into an in-game version, which Ascendancy, Necromancer, or Elementalist will be better version at this point in the game? Well, what I'm going to do here is walk you guys through a kind of crash course on the best upgrading paths for both those versions so you can kind of get an idea about the costs it takes to really get going on an in-game version, and then after that I'm going to give you guys my opinion on which is better. So first, the Elementalist, and lucky for us, this version is very easy to upgrade for very little currency. Like I mentioned earlier, your first two purchases on the character are going to be 2 Clay Shapers, and from there you're going to want to purchase a 6-link, either a Tabula Rasa or a cheap corrupted 6-link chest with the exact colors that you need for Carrion Golems. Once you have that, you're going to start your currency farming for your Primordial Jewels. Primordial Might should be your first purchase since it makes your golems aggressive, which is a huge quality of life boost, making your maps clear a lot faster. After that, we're going to be picking up a Primordial Harmony and Eminence, and then you actually want to purchase a second Primordial Might. Once you have the second Might, go ahead and vendor together the second Primordial Might, the Eminence, and the Harmony. That will pop out an Anima Stone from the vendor. From there, we're going to go ahead and purchase another Primordial Harmony and Eminence to complete the set. The full purchase of your initial Primordial Jewels should cost you about 2x in the first week or 2 of the league. It's not too bad on the Elementalist because you're not spending currency on anything else besides those jewels, so you can get them pretty early on. Once you have your jewels, go ahead and start saving up for a single Cold Iron Point dagger and a nice juicy tanky shield to go with it. An early Lionized Remorse shield is a great pickup here for a ton of life and only a few chaos spent. Once you have that, your next purchase should be a level 21 Carrion Golem gem, and after that start crafting a helmet to house your Animate Guardian and your Spectres in. When you start doing those in-game bosses, getting an Animate Guardian up and running should become a top priority since it adds so much survivability and damage. Somewhere in there, you're also going to be start grabbing your Brass Dome 6-link, upgrading your rings, your boots, your gloves, a Zabakwa Timeless Jewel for chaos resistance, and in general just making your way towards the min-max version of the build. All in all, you're looking at about 50 to 80 exalts to finish your in-game build, which compared to the aura stacking Necro version is actually pretty solid. As far as the Necro version, you're actually going to have the exact same purchase path all the way up to purchasing your Primordial Jewels. Likewise, once you have your Primordial Jewels for the +2 to maximum golems, you can drop your Clay Shaper in place of an Cold Iron Point dagger. However, once you've gotten those, your progression path does change. In order to switch to the budget low-life version, you're going to want the following items at an absolute minimum: a Prism Guardian Shield, Sintrek Boots, a Solaris Lorica, hopefully at least 5 linked, and lastly, your Purity Fire, Lightning, and Cold to be as high level as possible. Even purchasing level 20 versions of the gems or even level 21 is very worth the currency since you're going to have very little ES to start out with, and getting those resistances to max out is incredibly important. With that initial set of gear, you're looking at a total spend of about 6 or so exalts, near double the cost of the elemental version at this point in the build. Once you have that initial set, you're going to be wanting to start working towards getting a Vertex helmet or any high ES helmet with some chaos resistance and maybe even some dexterity. Same thing with the gloves needing high ES, and then from there start working on at minimum a 5-link Shabard's Wrappings. That's going to get you at least 1,000+ ES over the Solaris Lorica, which is going to be a huge upgrade. Same thing for your next upgrade, which is going to be a Presence of Chayula amulet, which is going to get you another 1,000 or so ES. We get that one by having a Blessing of Chayula, which are kind of expensive early on. After that, we're going to be picking up Charisma Anointment for your amulet to reserve even more ores, which again is going to be costing you 2 golden oils, which at the start of a league is pretty expensive. At this point, those last upgrades, you're going to be looking at having spent about 20 exalts. You're going to be about the same tankiness level as the Elementalist version, but you will definitely have more damage at this point since you're going to have so many strong auras. And that's really just to get started though. To finish out the in-game version of the Necro build, you're looking at about 80 to 120 exalts. And that brings us to my opinion on the winner for the in-game version of the build. Personally, I'm going to be going with the Elementalist going forward. Overall, it's going to cost you about 30% less than the Necro version, but you're still going to have basically the same level of defenses, and while yes, you're going to have a little bit less DPS, you're going to have still enough DPS to kill all those in-game bosses just fine. So I think it's just a better investment in your currency for an early league character. That brings us to the next section, which is more of a recap on the last one. The build cost for each version of the build. For the budget versions of each build, I'd say you're looking at spending about a max of 2 exalts on the Elementalist version, and you're going to be spending about 6 exalts on the low-life aura stacking Necromancer version. For the in-game build, you're going to be looking at spending an average of 65 exalts on the Elementalist version, compared to a 100 exalts on the Necromancer version. For the absolute min-max versions of the build, you're going to be looking at spending about 150 exalts on the Elementalist and about 250 for the aura stacking Necromancer, and that could even double if you get some super choice items for even more survivability. For our next section, we're going to briefly recap my thoughts on the differences in DPS for each version. For this comparison, I'm going to be using the in-game versions of the builds. So for the Elementalist, overall you're looking at about 22 million total DPS between your Golems, and that's without Animate Guardian factored in. With a buffed up Animate Guardian, it's more like 25 million DPS. That's compared to the 32 million DPS that you're going to get with an in-game Necromancer Aura Stacker. That of course goes up to about 36 million with a buffed Animate Guardian. So how do those numbers compare? Well, honestly, it might look like a lot, but in any real situation where you're killing a boss or mapping, it's very hard to tell the difference. The only place it's really noticeable is in 100% delirium mapping, since mobs just have such high health pools. In that case, the winner is definitely the Necromancer, since it can pump out more damage. In my opinion, I think they're both fantastic when it comes to DPS, and both will shine in most all in-game scenarios, so there's no real issue here that would make you want to pick one or the other. If you do want to kill things 10 to 15% faster, then go with that Necromancer, but just know that you're going to be spending a lot more currency to get those damage numbers. Or you could just be spending a lot less currency and run in an extra 3 circles around the boss and it dies just the same. Personally, I'm going to be going with an Elementalist here as my winner. For the survivability differences between the versions, there's actually quite a lot going on for both builds, and they do very different things to end up at the same result. Both are incredibly tanky and make for very easy and forgiving playstyles. The Necromancer focuses on getting 90% max all elemental resistance, a decent bit of flat physical resistance, 75% chaos resistance, pretty decent block chance, and a high ES regen per second. All that comes out to a very strong and tanky character that can survive most all in-game fights with minimal effort dodging boss mechanics. The Elementalist, on the other hand, focuses on getting up to 88 to 89% chaos resistance, mixed with the Divine Flesh Keystone, which makes elemental damage have to go through your chaos resistance. That mixed with a flat 90% physical damage resistance, a 3000 HP elemental damage shield, and a constant 3000 HP physical damage shield from Molten Shell. You end up with a crazy tanky character that, in my opinion, is actually more tanky than the Necromancer. I've played both versions extensively this league and in past leagues, and in the current state of both builds, I can certainly say that my Elementalist is able to tank much more scary content than the Necro could, which basically means I get to use my brain less while playing, which is always a nice bonus. Overall, I'd say the two builds are very close to tied in this category, with the Elementalist once again very slightly pulling ahead. For boss killing, we've kind of already talked about this, so I'm just going to kind of mention it, that honestly both builds are pretty tied here, with both being able to tackle the scariest content in the game with no problems. The two builds, in my opinion, are two of the best builds out there for boss killing right now. The playstyle is just unbeatable. Running in circles around a boss and being able to dodge boss mechanics while your golems do damage is incredibly strong for new players and veterans alike trying to learn new boss fights. I would, however, say again that I think the Elementalist creeps out ahead here, at least in my personal experience. While I was able to kill the feared in-game boss fight on both versions of the build, I was only able to kill the 120% quantity corrupted version of the map with my Elementalist. The Necro just couldn't handle it, and my Carrion golems were actually dying, which was a mega bummer. That wasn't a problem for the Elementalist though. I do typically use 1 to 2 portals for those crazy roll maps, but I'm able to finish them every time with the build, whereas I cannot do that on the Necro version. For mapping, this will actually be a super quick section here because there's honestly no real difference between either of the builds. Both are kind of meh at mapping. These builds are really meant for boss killing. Granted, they of course will still do every single map in the game, up to and including 100% delirium maps, no problem. Just note that when it comes to mapping, whether it be regular mapping your way through the Atlas or doing 100% delirium mapping, Carrion golems, no matter what version you're going to be playing, will only be above average at clearing them. They're really not the best AoE clearing ability out there, so don't expect the clear times to be, say, like the Blade Vortex fire conversion build. It's just not going to happen, so don't expect that. Alright, so if you've made it this far into the video, then you're likely pretty into Carrion Golems and are eventually going to want to min-max your build as best as possible. So this section is going to be exactly what you're looking for. Let's make it short and sweet. Overall, my personal opinion is that the Necromancer or stacking build is the way to go for if you want to spend tons and tons of exalts to min-max your build. You end up with more damage over the Elementalist, and with even more currency put into the build, you do end up with eventually more survivability than the Elementalist. You'll want to be looking for a double corrupted Prism Guardian with some physical damage taken as elemental damage, as well as level 23 discipline on that shield, a Watcher's Eye with any combo of the following best in slot mods, any of the physical damage taken as Ele mods, 2.5% ES regen per second while affected by discipline, 10% of mana as maximum ES while affected by clarity, life regen per second while affected by vitality, or even your phase while affected by haste. Any of those three combos together would be absolutely insane. We don't even get a Watcher's Eye on the Elementalist version since you need all those primordial jewels, so it's a big boost here in defenses that the normal in-game Necro build might not have the currency for, but if you're min-maxing, you can go ahead and get. Also, getting an ES helmet with chaos resistance and reduced mana reservation, even with an enchant to further reduce your mana reservation via haste or pride, will get you an extra aura, which is pretty crazy for even more damage. Or you could even fit in something like Arctic Armor for even more defense. Corrupting your boots or your gloves for +2 to maximum auras gets you up to 90% max all resistance, which is very solid as well. All of those min-max upgrades do push you over the threshold where I would say the Necro version becomes much better than the Elementalist. Just note that you're looking at several hundred more exalts for those upgrades. At the end of the day, it really just comes down to personal preference. If you want to dish out the extra damage, then you're going to have to dish out the extra currency for those upgrades, or be content with spending far less for the Elementalist version. To round out the min-max section here, I just mentioned that while there's not much you can do to further min-max the Elementalist version, a few things I would suggest actually just improve your DPS, not necessarily your survivability, but you could get a +1 to socket a Gem's Brass Dome, a Corrupted Torrent's Reclamation Belt with Pride or Haste Aura effect, and lastly you could go with a 12 passive point cluster large jewels similar to the Spectre build cluster jewels that are pretty meta right now. You just of course go with the light version instead of the ES version. With doing all of those, you're probably going to end up squeezing about another 3 to 4 million DPS per golem, so not too bad at all. But overall, like I said, my winner here for a fully min-maxed version of the build does go to the Necromancer. So that brings us to the conclusion of the discussion and my final thoughts on which is better, Elementalist or Necromancer. As you can see on the screen here, these are my winners for each of the categories we went over. The Elementalist version is the clear winner overall, at least in my opinion. And while the Necro does take the cake for being the better build to min-max, personally I think I'll be sticking with the Elementalist version going forward for future leagues. That is, unless they remove Harvest Crafting and we're not able to get the Chaos Resistance as easily going forward. I hope I was able to shed some light on the ever so popular question, is the Carrion Golem or stacking Necromancer better than the Carrion Golem Elementalist? Well, my answer, the Elementalist is currently king. That's all I got for this one guys, thanks everyone, and I will catch y'all in the next one.